Sunday, December the 7th, 1941, was regarded by American President Roosevelt as a date which will live in infamy. This is certainly true. However, due to numerous Hollywood retellings of the story clouding the, historical facts, shall we put it, I have endeavoured to make this video in an attempt to try and explain the actual course of events which took place on that day. Now, there is a commonly held misbelief that the first shots of the Pacific War were fired by the Japanese. However, this is not true, as in fact the very first shots and casualties of the Pacific War were caused by the American ship USS Ward, which would later be sunk by a kamikaze off the island of Okinawa in 1945, when she depth-charged a Japanese midget sub around the entrance to Pearl Harbour at approximately 06:37 am. However, the real attack began at around 07:49, when the Japanese commander of the first wave of dive bombers, fighters and torpedo bombers, Captain Mutsuo Fushida, gave the signal "Tura, Tura, Tura," meaning attack, maximum surprise achieve, and not, as some people believe, Tora, 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 as in the Japanese phrase tiger, tiger, tiger. The first major casualty on Battleship Row was the USS Oklahoma, which between 0750 and 0753 hours suffered 3 major torpedo strikes. The list of the ship, coupled with water and oil spilling onto the deck, made the guns inoperable. At the same time, the destroyer Raleigh and the pre-World War I battleship Utah were also struck by torpedoes. 2 minutes later, at 0752, the USS California was torpedoed at the furthest southwestern point of Battleship Row. Meanwhile, Japanese planes began to strafe and bomb Ford Airfield, and by 0755, Japanese planes were over Hickam Field. It was also at this time that the first escape attempt from Pearl Harbor began, as the USS Helm turned into the Western Lock and made a break for the Pacific. At 0756, the West Virginia felt 3 rapid shocks, all to port, and began to list heavily. At the same time, 2 large explosions rocked the USS Arizona, and a wall of flame began to move south from the Arizona to the West Virginia and the adjacent Tennessee at around 0758. Other torpedoes struck the already wounded Oklahoma and West Virginia. The Tennessee was then struck. By 0800 hours, the Oklahoma was capsizing, the California was sinking at the stern, and the West Virginia was ablaze. The Pennsylvania, which was in dry dock, had been dive-bombed, and the Tennessee had been hit in both the second and third turret. The bombs had missed Pennsylvania, but had struck the nearby destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs. However, soon after, another bomb did strike the fore of the Pennsylvania. Immediately afterwards, the Utah and Raleigh came under renewed attack and were struck by torpedoes. At 08:02, the USS Nevada, alone at the northeastern tip of Battleship Row, was struck by a torpedo on her port bow. Around this time, the dive bombers began to attack both the harbour and Hickam Field. By 08:05, the Utah had been abandoned as more torpedoes struck her and Raleigh, and by 08:10 she had capsized. It was noted that by this time around 6 or 7 torpedoes had been put into Battleship Row between the Oklahoma, Nevada, West Virginia and Arizona. As several battleships died, one was preparing to make a bid for safety. At 08:15, the Nevada was reported to have slipped her chains and was heading away from the charnel house of Battleship Row. At 08:17, the USS Helm noticed another midget sub by the buoy at the harbour entrance, but was unable to fire as she was headed out of the harbour. By 08:20, the blaze aboard the Arizona was beginning to engulf the adjacent USS Vestal. Then at around that moment, a torpedo passed after the Vestal and struck the Arizona. At the same moment, a bomb also struck the Arizona, which went through a vent and detonated inside the ship, leading to a chain reaction which blew up the forward magazine. Also at this time, another torpedo struck the California. By 08:32, the Oklahoma finally capsized, and the Arizona suffered further damage, both from another salvo of bombs and torpedoes. By 08:40, the California was damaged by 4 near hits, and 5 minutes later, the Vestal noticed the Arizona's decks were awash and began to pull away. By 0900, the second attack wave swooped in and attacked both the Bellows and Wheeler air bases along with the remaining ships in Battleship Row, including further hits on the Pennsylvania and strikes on the Maryland. By midday it was over. The Maryland had been damaged, the Nevada had been beached near the Helm starting position at Hospital Point, the California was taking on water and would eventually sink 3 days later, the West Virginia had been sunk, the Tennessee was burning and trapped between her moorings and the wreck of the West Virginia, the Pennsylvania was damaged in dry dock, the Oklahoma had capsized, and the Arizona had been blown apart. In addition, most of the American aircraft had been destroyed. However, crucially, the American carrier force had been untouched due to their absence, and the oil depots also survived. This allowed for America to rapidly respond to Japan, and merely 7 months later, at Midway, 4 of the 6 Japanese attack carriers were sunk: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. And by the end of 1944, the remaining 2, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, had also been destroyed. I hope my brief summing up of Pearl Harbor has been in some way informative, and to any fans of the film Pearl Harbor, just so you know, the Americans didn't win the Battle of Britain, it was us, okay? Thank you for watching.